Here today. I'm so thrilled to see the turnout, and I'd especially like to welcome the students from my research methods class, who, not surprisingly, as predicted, are all sitting at the back of the room. So well done. Thank you for coming today. I appreciate the support. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Intellectual Disability Research team here at UL, and that includes, if you want to just pop up really quickly, Barry Coughlin, and Stephen Gallagher, and Owen Judy, and Eileen Carey. Where's Eileen? She's probably, oh, there she is over there. She's tucked away. And we have a research assistant very happily with us today, or we're happy to have her, and that's Aideen Higgins. And so, I'd also like to thank the University of Limerick for making this possible through the seed funding that we received back a few months ago to get this whole day orchestrated. So I'm very appreciative to the university for that. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dan here today. I wouldn't say I was pleased to meet him the first time, though. 2 years ago, I was very nervous to meet him the first time because 2 years ago, he was actually the external examiner for my doctoral viva. So since we're both in the room and smiling at each other, it went well. So Dan is a professor of disability psychology and disability studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, and we're so happy to have him here today to be with us and to give us a little bit of a taste of his work in critical disability studies and really looking at the future directions for disability research in Ireland, in the UK, and kind of internationally is what we'll see. We'll see where you go with that, Dan. All right. So without further ado, instead of me talking, I'll turn it over to Dan. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to the University of Limerick for funding my trip. I spent a lot of time in Galway over the years with friends, so it's quite unusual to be sat in Ireland just after 12 without a pint of Guinness in my hand. I'll try and get through that. If anyone's got any gin, they could have. So what I want to do is, in this, well, firstly, I'm based in Manchester Met, as Nancy mentioned. We have a research community called Critical Disability Studies. There's our website. If I spell it, my wife is Welsh, she's probably doing a Welsh accent. www.cdsmmu.posterous, not preposterous, posterous.com. Please visit our website. We have a number of resources on there. One of our things we're most excited about is we have a YouTube channel where we interview researchers, academics, activists, and we say, right, you've got 8 minutes to tell us about, for example, a book you've written, and it's very interesting how particularly academics have warmed to this idea of talking about themselves over an 8-minute period. So please check that out. So there's a number of great videos on there, including people like Rod McCalco, Jeremy Hoy, who's a guy with the Labour of Learning Difficulties and others. Okay, what I want to do in this talk is I want to talk about theory, but I want to try hopefully do it in a way which is not going to bore you to tears. So those who sat at the back, if it does, you can obviously fall asleep. But what I want to do is to give some kind of theoretical overview of what's happening in disability studies. Can I have a show of hands of people who would say they know something about disability studies? That's some of you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that you know something about it, but not loads. And what I want to do is to throw in some debates which I think are key themes and will be key themes as we look over the future within disability studies. So if the late 20th century disability studies were associated with establishing the factors that led to the structural, economic and cultural conditions of the exclusion of people with impairments, and that's a whole host of impairments, then I think it's right to suggest that disability studies in the current century might be seen as a time of developing very nuanced and sophisticated ideas around disability. Now, I want to make it very clear that this is not simply about theory and it's not about the academy, and it's not about academics. Clearly, the politicisation of disabled people is at the heart of any of these developments. So, disability activisms have grown throughout the globe. We've seen the United Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and we've seen the growth of organisations such as the Disabled People's International. And because of the politics of disabled people, we have something called disability studies. And there could not be disability studies without the politics of disability. But what's happened, I'm going to tease out, is that disability studies has developed now in some very nuanced, and I would suggest quite sophisticated theoretical ways. So this is not simply about academic curiosity or theoretical curiosity, though some people would say what's wrong with that. The idea of these developments is that they actually contribute and challenge the ways in which disabled people live their lives, and hopefully for the better. Now, Carol Thomas defines disability studies as a transdisciplinary space. And she uses the word trans rather than interdisciplinary, because what she's arguing is that disability studies is breaking down boundaries between disciplines. It's deconstructing things like professional lay distinctions. I like it when my psychologist colleagues talk about, well, what would the lay person say? You know, they see themselves as experts, and there's the lay person that I believe they occasionally meet in the street and maybe ruffle their hair. And perhaps even smell. What's disability studies is it's challenging those kind of those distinctions, and crucially, as I'm sure you'll be aware, it's challenging the medicalization of disability, or some might call it the over-medicalization of disability. Now, in its place, what disability studies does, it does a number of things, but particularly in Britain, and I'll suggest a lot of Irish colleagues as well, is it focuses upon disablism. And disablism is defined by Carol Thomas as a form of social oppression involving the social imposition of restrictions of activity on people with impairments and the socially engendered undermining of their psycho-emotional well-being. Or, to paraphrase Gilles Deleuze, it's what society does when it fucks you up. Right? So this is what disablism is about. That is actually a direct quote, by the way. Just to, like, you know, suggest that Gilles Deleuze swore, but it actually did say it. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about what critical disability studies is, and then I want to present to you a number of things which I think are important, and I think are going to drive the development of critical disability studies. Now, I'm going to define critical disability studies here as starting with disability but never ending with it. Disability is the space from which to think through a host of political, theoretical and practical issues that are relevant to everybody. And Tanya Tichkowski, she's writing from Canada, argues that disability gives us the opportunity to ask again what we understand by the word human. And I want to kind of come back to that idea. Now, this transdisciplinary space means that it has led to a number of emerging insights. And what I want to do now for the rest of this talk is to talk you through a number of these emerging insights, which are theoretical, but they have a lot of practical applications, and they raise a number of practical questions. So, the picture on the overhead here is of my daughters stood before Karl Marx's tombstone in May this year, 2 days after the royal wedding. We've been meaning to visit for a while, but after witnessing many of my closet royalist Brit friends reveal their true colours, and perhaps wannabe blue blood, we realised that a visit was necessary, maybe essential. So we went down to it, and it was fantastic, and there they are punching the air. And it was a very, very emotional moment when they actually started to read out, you know, Workers of All Lands Unite, and explain that. Now, it was a horrendous weekend personally for me, the whole royal wedding, because suddenly it seemed that we were all royalists in England, and I didn't think we were. And I made this point to recognise and celebrate Marxism's contribution to disability studies. In Britain, we have something called the social model of disability. Can I have a show of hands for people who've heard of the social model of disability? Great, so thank you. Now, this is not simply a social model. In Britain, it really is a materialist social theory of disability. And it has been profound in terms of changing people's lives. Key writers include people like Mike Oliver, Colin Barnes, Vic Finkelstein, who have unashamedly drawn upon a Marxist understanding of the material barriers to work, education and community living. And in the context where anti-discriminatory legislation was still only a dream, their analyses were a clarion call to activists and academics alike to identify and overturn the material conditions of disablement. So I want to kick off by acknowledging that. The thing is, though, as those of us who have read or engaged with Marxism, is that materialism, whilst very useful in identifying, for example, the ways in which physical barriers deny people an opportunity to live an everyday life, it says very little about the mundane, day-to-day ways in which disabled people live their lives. So while political activists have drawn upon this approach to look at, for example, the lack of employment opportunities, what does this theory say, for example, about the reason why non-disabled people stare at disabled people? What is it about disability that seems to scare people? What is it about disability that actually leads to massive fascination? So a friend of mine has restricted growth, and he will say, you know, on a regular daily basis, he will only get people staring at him, but now actually asking him some of the most bizarre questions. One he got asked the other day was, can you kick yourself in the head? And I said to him, well, can you? He said, yes, that's what's important like that. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a need within critical disability studies to look to other theoretical ideas which might allow us to think more about those things that are excluded by a materialist viewpoint. So if you're looking at the literature, we have seen a number of theoretical developments. People like Margaret Shildrick argue now that we need to draw upon post-conventional theory. Others have argued that we need to talk about postmodern theory. And others have talked about post-structuralism. And I wanted to look at a little bit about this in a short while. A really nice starting point then to think about this first theme is offered by a writer called Leonard Davis. And Leonard Davis argues that we now live in a time of dismodernism. He's a really annoying academic. He comes up with these brilliant phrases that get lots of currency. Dismodernism. And he says here that in a dismodernist society, disability links together other identities as the moment of reflection. For Davis, disabled people are the ultimate, quote, intersectional subject. They allow us a way to understand the ways in which we view ourselves and other people and our bodies. And to bodies and minds is what I want to now talk about. So one of the first things that a social model of disability did in Britain was to sever the link between a society that excludes and an impaired body or mind. For disabled activists, the issue is not what is wrong with my body or mind, but what is wrong with society. Now, a number of writers of the past 5 to 10 years have argued that this is problematic. Tom Shakespeare, I don't know if anyone's heard of Tom Shakespeare here, has written a fantastic book in 2006, which got absolutely panned in the disability studies world, because he was brave enough to ask this question: what about impairment? For Shakespeare, the body, he argues, has been denied in disability studies. Because disabled activists and disabled researchers wanted to look at the ways in which society excluded people with impairments. But this is not good enough for Shakespeare. He argues that a social model actually ends up ignoring the importance of impairments. He says this: impairments are important because some are static, others episodic, some degenerative, and some kill. And for him, impairment is a predicament that can also be tragic. Now, what we've seen there within disability studies is this move towards the body. And it's what was being called a realist term, that we need to take on board the reality of our bodies. What I want to suggest today is that the body is real is actually problematic and ignores the fact that all our bodies are always made in a very cultural, political, historical context. I'll quote a couple of people here. This is Anne Maguire. She says this: disability marks the body in ambiguous ways. It appears and disappears, is noticed and is hidden. And as we move through different physical and social spaces, and as we find ourselves in different political and historical moments, the body means different things in different places. My mate Rob has the label of Tourette syndrome. He says, and I've been with him, for example, we've been on a train together, and he says, well, notice how I become social cement. And he gets onto the train, as he puts it, Mr. T kicks off, where he swears a lot and he moves, and he says, look, and you look over, and there's total strangers start talking to one another about him. Right? He says, it's fascinating. I can go into a room where no one's talking to one another, within 5 minutes, they're all chatting about me. But no one ever comes up to me and says, why are you doing that?